The sea does not forgive hesitation. In the bridge cockpit of the USS Barb, a fleet submarine running on the surface just after midnight on August 19, 1944, this was not a philosophy but a physical law. The air was warm, thick with salt and diesel fumes. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Flucky stood with his officers, his eyes straining against the darkness of the East China Sea near the Korean island of Fukushima. They had been hunting in the shallow, treacherous waters of the Sea of Japan for weeks, a foray so successful and audacious it had drawn the attention of the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, the hunter was being cornered. Flucky, at 31, was not a typical submarine commander. He possessed an aggressive, almost joyful offensive spirit, tempered by a cool, mathematical mind. The Barb was his instrument, a Gato-class boat, 311 feet of steel, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a 3-inch deck gun. Her crew, a mix of seasoned veterans and young sailors, had been forged under his command into a unit of unparalleled efficiency and confidence. They had just completed a legendary patrol, sinking over 30,000 tons of enemy shipping. Flucky had requested and been granted permission for one final sweep before heading home. That decision had led them here, to the mouth of a heavily mined harbor on the Korean coast, where their soundman, sonarman First Class James Richard, now picked up a new set of contacts. Con sonar, multiple screws bearing 300, estimate many. Richard's voice, calm but edged with urgency, came through the speaker, classifying as warships, fast. On the bridge, Flucky and his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander William Barney Seagleff, exchanged a glance. They raised their binoculars. At first, nothing. Then shapes began to resolve out of the gloom, not the low silhouettes of freighters or tankers, but the high, angular profiles of warships, a lot of them. Lookouts called out bearings in hushed tones. The tally grew with each passing minute. Through the high-powered Big Eyes binoculars, Flucky identified them: destroyers, frigates, patrol boats, and the distinct, bulky outline of at least one mine layer or small escort carrier. They were moving in a formation, a convoy screen, but surrounding what? There was no large merchant vessel at the center. This was a hunter-killer group, and their prey, the Barb, was caught on the surface, inside their perimeter. All stations battle surface. Man battle stations torpedo. Flucky's order was quiet, deliberate. The alarm klaxon blared throughout the boat, a sound that turned blood to ice. Feet pounded on decks as men sprinted to their positions. The hatches slammed shut. In the conning tower, the atmosphere tightened. The plotting team began frantically marking positions. The initial count was over 20 distinct sonar and visual contacts. The final estimate would settle at 28. 28 warships, ranging from small sub-chasers with depth charges to full-size destroyers armed with deck guns and the latest Japanese sonar. The Barb was alone. Her maximum submerged speed was 9 knots. The Japanese destroyers could make over 30. The water depth was less than 200 feet, too shallow for deep diving evasion. They were in a sack, and the drawstrings were being pulled tight. Down the hatch, Flucky ordered the last man to descend. The heavy bridge hatch clanged shut above him, sealing them in a steel tube. Take her down, make your depth 150 feet. Rig for silent running, rig for depth charge. The diving officer, Lieutenant Phil Haynes, repeated the commands. The vents opened with a hiss of compressed air. The boat tilted forward, the bow planes biting into the water. The sounds of the world above, the wind, the waves, were replaced by the internal hum of machinery and the pounding of hearts. The control room was a pool of red battle lighting, faces illuminated in stark relief, eyes fixed on gauges. Depth 100 feet. Leveling off. All compartments report rigged for depth charge and silent running. The silence they imposed was absolute. Men stopped moving. Machinery not essential for depth control was shut down. Even the ventilation fans were secured. The only sounds were the subtle creaks of the pressure hull and the distant, ever louder ping, ping, ping of Japanese sonar. The soundman, Richard, became the eyes of the boat. He wore his headphones like a crown of thorns, his entire body listening. He began to paint the acoustic picture. Multiple sonar bearings now, Con. They're spreading out. They have us bracketed. Destroyers bearing 010 and 270. Closing. Speed fast. His voice was a monotone, a deliberate control to prevent panic from infecting his report. On the plot, the colored grease pencil marks formed a tightening noose around their single, stationary mark. Then the first patterns came. Not the sporadic, searching charges of a lone escort, but a coordinated, overwhelming barrage. The Japanese commanders knew their business. Wump, wump, wumpy, wump. The sea exploded. The shockwaves hit the barb like a giant swinging a sledgehammer against her hull. Lights flickered. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Dust and paint chips snowed from the overhead. The sound was not just heard. It was felt in the teeth and the bones. A deep, concussive boom that vibrated through the steel, followed by the terrifying sound of water under extreme pressure tearing at the hull seams. In the after-torpedo room, a small spray of seawater jetted from a valve gland. A machinist's mate, without a word, grabbed a wrench and tightened it, his hands steady. Flucky stood in the control room, one hand on a pipe to steady himself. His face was calm, almost analytical. He was counting. He was calculating. Depth charges worked on probability. A pattern of 6, 8, 10 charges were dropped in a grid. The idea was not necessarily a direct hit. A direct hit would split a submarine in half, but to create a pressure field that would buckle hull plates, rupture pipes, or damage critical systems. The Barb's only hope was to stay quiet, not give them a new active target to aim at, and slowly, impossibly, slip through the gaps in the moving screen. Con sonar. High-speed screws passing overhead, port to starboard, close. Another pattern, closer this time. Wump, wump, wump. The boat shuddered violently. A gauge glass shattered. A man cursed softly. The depth gauge needle swung wildly before settling. They were being bounced around in a washing machine made of concussive force. In the crew's mess, dishes shattered in their locked cabinets. The air began to taste of battery acid, dust, and fear. For over 30 minutes, the storm continued. The Japanese ships, methodical and relentless, ran their search patterns. They would make a sonar pass, drop a pattern, listen, then move to a new bearing. Flucky knew they were trying to drive him into shallow water or toward a waiting partner. He gave his only possible order: all ahead, dead slow, make no turns. Any change in propeller noise would be a beacon. They would creep, an underwater glacier on a steady course away from the harbor mouth. It was a game of millimeters, played with thousands of tons of steel and high explosive. In the sonar shack, Richard's shirt was soaked with sweat. He was filtering out the roar of descending depth charges, the thrash of propeller screws, the ping of active sonar to listen for the subtler sounds, the change in pitch of a destroyer's screws as it turned away, the slightly different sound signature of a frigate versus a chaser. Destroyer on bearing 270, turning away, increasing range, he whispered into his mic. A tiny opening. Flucky acknowledged. The plotting team updated the chart. The noose had a slight bulge. Helm, come right to course 090, very slowly. The helmsman, his hands gripping the wheel as if it were a lifeline, eased the turn. The boat groaned in protest. Every man aboard held his breath, waiting for the telltale ping that would indicate they'd been heard. None came. For another hour, the cat and mouse continued, but the intensity of the attacks lessened. The patterns fell farther astern. The Barb, by maintaining perfect silence and not reacting predictably, had become a ghost. The Japanese commanders, confident in their overwhelming numbers and the shallow trap, likely believed they had sunk her, or they were conserving depth charges for a confirmed contact. Finally, Richard delivered the most beautiful sentence Flucky had ever heard. Con sonar, screams fatting on all bearings. Last close contact bearing 340, moving away fast. I think they're forming up and departing. A palpable physical wave of relief washed through the boat. Shoulders slumped. Men let out breaths they didn't know they'd been holding. But Flucky's face didn't change. The escape was not yet complete. They were still in shallow, mined, enemy-controlled waters. They had to get out of the Sea of Japan through the heavily patrolled straits. "All ahead 1/3, Flucky ordered, his voice breaking the long silence. "Bring her up to periscope depth. Let's take a look." As the barb rose cautiously, Flucky gripped the handles of the periscope. He broke the surface and made a slow 360-degree sweep. The dawn was just breaking, painting the sea in hues of gray and pink. It was empty. Not a mast, not a funnel, not a wake in sight. The armada was gone. He allowed himself a small, tight smile. They had faced 28 warships and lived. But Eugene Flucky was not a man to simply escape. The barb's patrol was not over. Days later, demonstrating the relentless aggression that defined him, he would execute one of the most daring raids of the Pacific War, sending a landing party ashore on the Japanese mainland to blow up a train, the only ground combat operation on the Japanese home islands during the war. Yet, the escape from the hunter-killer group remained the defining moment of tactical brilliance and sheer fortitude. The legacy of the USS Barb and Commander Flucky is etched in naval history. The Barb finished the war as the top submarine in terms of tonnage sunk, and Flucky was awarded the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary leadership and aggressive patrols. But the lesson of that early August morning is deeper than tonnage or medals. It is a lesson in the power of nerve, of trained silence under pressure, and of a commander's cool decision to do nothing as the world exploded around him. In the face of impossible odds, the men of the Barb did not panic. They listened, they endured, and in the heart of the tempest, they found a path where none seemed to exist.